It shows it on our screen.
Oh, now I am. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. Oh, man. All right. Now I have to start all over again. No. All right. Let's see. Where did I get to? Okay. The prophet of word is complaint. All right. Nor does he dispute the accuracy of the facts as Habakkuk had articulated them, stated them. So God is in agreement with about the corruption of the land and that it was terrible. Now, God does not have to follow man's design. Man may think he has the answer to the problem, but that doesn't mean that it's God's answer to the problem. And he responds to the problem at his time and in his manner. And that's going to be a reoccurring theme, and we need to think about Galatians chapter 4 and verse 4. In the fullness of time, God sent forth his son when the time was right. Nobody dictated to God when that would happen. God said, this is when it's going to be. Galatians 4:4. All right. All right. So, verse, we're still there. Okay. He begins this verse 5 with behold. Okay. And this introduces then something unexpected, if not shocking. We must understand that God is behind the scenes and he's working out things. Okay. When we look, this is true throughout history. Look at Joseph and what took place there. When we look at what the prophecies of Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel and what's taking place there and setting up these kingdoms. Daniel chapter 2, in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom. So here were those three kingdoms then that were set up. And so God's working behind those scenes to set up what he wants. And Daniel chapter 2 talks about God rules in the kingdoms of men, and it's still true. And he also uses the word heathen there, which is talking about the Gentiles. And that they would be the agent of God's chastisement. Babylon would chastise Judah, but that doesn't relieve Babylon from being chastised either. So when we look at this, and he says, and wonder marvelously, the people may not comprehend what God's doing. But he is doing those things. He also says that he's working in your days. Okay. Yes. And he was working in the days of Habakkuk. I still think he's working today. And this, then he's, let's see, and wonder marvelously, and I work in your days. This is Hebrew called the cognate accusative. And it underscores the activity. And the participle suggests either current action or intimate action. Intimate action, not intimate, but intimate action. IMMINENT, close by. And let's see, what verse is this? My New Testament. I don't think I brought it in here with me.
New Testament?
Yeah. Did I? That's what I want. Okay. This verse is also used in Acts chapter 13. And I want to read Acts chapter 13, 40 and 41. And Paul's quoting from this situation, talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And that's what Habakkuk's talking about, the destruction of Jerusalem. Different circumstances, but still the destruction of Jerusalem. One was with Babylon, when Babylon would come down and destroy Jerusalem. And then Paul's talking about AD 70, when Jerusalem would be destroyed then. And he says, beware therefore, lest that's spoken upon you, which is spoken of in the prophets, behold, ye despisers and wonders and perish. For I work a work in your day, a work which ye shall in no wise believe, though a man declare it unto you. Okay. Then in verse 6, really, some translations may have behold in that also. I think, and when he says for lo in the King James, that's the same thing as the behold in verse 5. And he says, I will raise up the Chaldeans. So that we know that you're talking about the Babylonians.
Chaldeans or Babylonians?
Yes. And that's the agent that he's going to use to chastise his people. Yeah, punish his people. And the reason I use the word chastise is because that's what Hebrews chapter 12 talks about, the chastisement of the Lord there. Now understand, the Babylonians or the Chaldeans were not a new people in the stage of history. So when we look at Chaldean coming onto the scene, they destroyed Nineveh, they come down and they destroy Jerusalem. Then they are the world power, okay, in the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. And he was the greatest of their kings. Understand, because when in Daniel chapter 2, the head of fine gold is Nebuchadnezzar. And so it goes down from there, it goes down from gold to silver to bronze, and then to iron mixed with clay. All right, God raises up kings and he brings them down in his marvelous wisdom. But in this, we can see then, here's the preparation for the world for the Messiah. And that goes back to Galatians chapter 4. All right, now, and the rest of chapters, we're talking about chapter 6 versus the rest of 6. And then he's going to identify the special agent. He already has identified calling the Chaldeans, but he's going to talk about those Chaldeans. He's going to describe then.
In verse 7 and on.
6, he's going to talk about how they marched through the breadth of the land and this type of thing. So here's the description of what they're going to do. And there are about 20 features. I don't know if we'll notice all, point them out directly, but there's about 20 different features that are noted. And several of these are in couplets too. He describes the Chaldeans as bitter and hasty, angry or impetuous. That's what he's talking about with bitter and hasty. Then he talks about how they'll march through the land. They'll advance swiftly, recklessly, in all directions. And in their path, there would be no time to escape. That's how quick they were. They just... And some of these words that he said, let's see, let me find this. To possess the dwelling place that are not there. These are words that also are used in like Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 10 and 11, when Israel will conquest the land, the promised land, how that they would possess a possession that's not theirs. Then in verse 7, he talks about how they be terrible and dreadful. Terrible is also found in Song of Solomon, chapter 6, verses 4 and 10. Did you get the chapter?
No.
6?
Verses.
Chapter 6. Okay.
It was found in which one again? I'm sorry.
Terrible is found in Song of Solomon, chapter 6, verses 4 and 10, and refers to the awe-inspiring character of an army with banners. All right, the second term, dreadful, indicates the feeling of foreboding. That one might experience when crossing a danger-infested wilderness. I'll go over that again. All right, here's that feeling of foreboding that one might experience when crossing a danger-infested wilderness, or by witnessing one of the mighty acts of God. took place in Exodus.
Is it Judgment Day referred to as dreadful?
Terrible.
Terrible day. Great and terrible.
Yeah. Then it also talks about in verse 7 there the judgment. And they demanded submission to their will and obedience to their law. They derived standards from no one, least of all God. The irony here is that God would use an agent who rendered no honor unto him. All right, now we're still talking about these 20 things there, but we're going to look at the Calvary now in this.
Verse 8.
Yeah, verses 8 and 9. And their cavalry made them a formidable force. Their horses were swifter than the leopards, and more fierce than the evening wolves. The horses, like leopards, then, is the speed. And the evening wolves are the fierceness. And then he talks about the rider, or the horseman, really, the horseman. And this is the proud and determined rider. And they swoop down like vultures. All right, and then he says their faces shall sup as the east wind. There's the violence and the goal. Well, the goal is violence, okay? The violence of the people. And they're eager to press on in their work. So they're so fierce, so awe-inspiring by man's standards that the enemy would avoid confrontation with them. Yet they would never avoid confrontation. They would never look back. Always forward. And then it says that they should gather as captive as the sand. There's the speed and determination. And the captives as the sand, that's talking about the number of captives. And the language hints at the inhumanity of the invaders. They had no sympathy. And then in verses 10 and 11, as we continue this thought, we're talking about their leaders now. They scoff at the kings and that type of things. The leaders, then, the royal figures, he holds them in contempt because they are unable to offer any effective resistance.
Now, their royal figures are held in contempt,
Uh,
or they're holding the other royal figures.
he's holding the enemy,
He is.
Yeah,
Habakkuk. Okay.
no, the Chaldean king is holding the royalty in contempt
Okay.
of the nations that they're invading,
Okay.
because they can offer no resistance. Let's see. The deriding then of every stronghold. Even the strongholds will fall easily to his troops. And then it says, they shall heap dust and take it. That's the building of the, what is it? The siege works. They build ramps up on those things, and they would, back then, because in walled city and whatever it took then, that's how they would get around those. And when they're coming against Judah, nobody can help Judah. Because when the Chaldeans come down, they've already captured Nineveh. Assyrian's not going to be able to do anything for them. Egypt on the south is not going to be able to do anything for them. And really, the Chaldeans are going to come in and just swoop all the way down. Then let's see, let's see, and then shall his mind change, and he shall pass over and offend and impute this power unto his God.
So he's giving his God credit.
Yes, he is. And he's going from one conquest to another conquest. And he is transgressing God both in attitude and action. He would begin to worship his own power. And he calls it his God. In his mind, might makes right. Then also, we find that in this, God's reply, he's hinting at the Chaldeans would meet their doom.
Say that again.
He's hinting in this oracle, in this talking. God is also implying that the Chaldeans would meet their doom. So, Habakkuk asked the question, kind of summarizing, how long? God responds, not long. And then the prophet asked, why?
Is that in 12?
No, we're just kind of summing up right
Okay.
now. And the prophet asked, why is there no justice? The Lord's response says, my vengeance is swift and terrible. It will even fall upon my own people. God's time, God's place, and God's way. Okay. Now, the second problem of Habakkuk, or the second complaint or problem, where the first complaint was about God's inactivity, this second one then is about God's actions. And here's Habakkuk going to be more bold in what he's talking about.
What he's talking about?
Uh-huh. Because he's going to say, why, here's Babylon, you're using Babylon, these are wicked people to chastise your people, Judah. And that's what he's going to talk about in the rest of this chapter. Well, chapter 2, verse 1. So this one starts out with also a rhetorical question, as the first one did. He asked, how long? This time he's going to ask, art thou not from everlasting, O Lord? Okay. So he's asking that question. My Holy One. Habakkuk felt a close relationship to God. This is not mockery, it's not skepticism, but it's a sincere question. And he recognizes that his perspective is not God's perspective. He's from everlasting. He's eternal. In this, he uses the word Elohim. Elohim. I would suggest that you read Adam Clarke on Elohim, and I think it's talking about in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and I think he talks about Elohim there, how that is a plural of the form God. And it would be well worth your time to read that article that he has on Genesis chapter 1. So if you have access to Adam Clarke, usually that's free. But look at that. That's an interesting concept there. The word El, as this word begins, it's talking about God. And you'll see a lot of those folks that are connected with God have El in their word. Bethel. Joel. That EL then has a
Reference
to God. Yes. Okay. Then the prayer also has. That's my mistake.
Hey, we're in class. That's okay. Hey, baby doll. Sweet pea.
Okay. Got to talk to grandbabies.
You are okay. But you.
All right.
Yeah.
This prayer continues then
Love you.
with an affirmation of understanding. Okay. So he understands. Now, yeah. This prayer continues with an affirmation of understanding. At least it didn't bump me off with Yahoo. With the other one, it did. It would jump me off. Okay.
Affirmation
of affirmation of understanding.
She called me a baby doll.
And he also indicates that the Chaldeans would not totally destroy the Jewish people. He says, we shall not die. So he understands that then they're not going to be totally wiped out. Okay, and he uses them to ordain them for judgment. Okay, that is the correction that we talked about. And if you'll notice in this passage, verse 12, he uses, O Lord, and then, O mighty God. So here is the name that they would use that represented God. It is underscoring the nature of God as the rock, who is immutable and unchangeable, or unchanging, put it that way.
That's part of the description of God Anna Clark gives. It's just wonderful.
Yes. Let's see. All right, verse 13. The announcement of the chastisement it's not what bothered Habakkuk. It is the necessity for judgment that's bothering him. And he asked the question then, how can let's see, where am I? Okay. How can God, the holy God, use such a wicked people to accomplish his purpose? Because he says, thou art purer than the eyes, and behold evil. And then how can God keep on remaining silent? Let's see.
In the face of wickedness.
Yeah, in the face of wickedness. In the past, God had swallowed up the wicked on behalf of Israel. Go back to the book of Exodus and Numbers.
God had done what to the wicked?
Swallowed them up.
Swallowed.
So they're now facing the prospects of being swallowed up by the enemies. So Habakkuk doesn't understand that. Because the Jews are so much better than the Chaldeans. All right, let's take a little break.
Now, you want to call your name?
No, I do want to.
Mike was even walking up the stairs, but they're sitting at the foot of the stairs. Mike was walking upstairs. He even started laughing when she said, "She called me a baby doll." But you were texting her?
No, Riley wanted my email address. She didn't sound like she was.
She looked fine.
Yeah.
And she acted cheerful.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I've seen her sick before, and she all swells up into her mama like most kids. Like,
Yeah.
you know, like that. But she wasn't doing that. She called baby doll. Stinker pot.
Yes, she thinks she's a big girl.
Mm-hmm. I should tell her that you could have been called you stinker pot. Stinker pot. Well, I thought about if you'll quit, let me talk to you. But you're still online.
Mhm.
Okay. We'll talk later.
Okay. So I can go and get down with 2. Okay. And take half a class next week. How many more weeks we got? 3? Yes, we have 3 weeks. I have 2 more teaching weeks, right? I have the 6th, the 13th. Okay. So I'll have to do something for Zephaniah. So we'd like to get through with chapter 2. I don't think we're going to do it, but I'd like to. We'll take up 3 and get into Zephaniah.
How reliable do you think Riley is?
Extremely.
How forgiving and understanding is he?
I think you will be extremely.
How confidential, keeping confidential.
I think he would do that too. He's got a son that's in
Well,
enforcement, so he understands that. I think he
well,
understands.
this is the thing I'm thinking. Well, I don't understand. Well, it's God. It's just gotta be God. I went through all that. Fingerprinting. I did everything. Background check. They did it to us all the time. Wasn't just one time.
Yeah, see, this is.
And it was nothing.
See, this is not even like.
And I'm wondering if there are some purpose codes that you can only get. But see, I've been told that was a legitimate conviction. And that's what you can pull up, or not just, but it says when I read about it, that they can pull up now all the arrest, even somebody falsely accused.
I don't think it's going to come up. I really don't think it is. They're just doing that from your name. So I just
From
don't.
your social.
Yeah.
That's,
But not your fingerprints. See, we had to have fingerprints.
Yeah.
Did you have to have fingerprints on? All right, is everybody back? Let's get started.
Yep.
All right, now verses 14 through 17. Here's 4 characteristics of the Chaldeans. And Hezekiah was struggling with this because,
Habakkuk, not Hezekiah.
Habakkuk then was struggling with this because here was the holy, gracious, and merciful God, and he was using the Chaldeans to punish Judah. So here's what he's struggling with, 4 areas. Number 1, the Chaldeans were ruthless. And he talks about that in verse 14. Talked about the fishes of the sea and creeping things and all that type of thing. They're small things.
This is the second one.
No, this is still under the ruthlessness.
What are small things?
The fishes, well, Judah is like the fish. They're just a small thing. Why would he use then such a large thing to correct his people? Now, God created man in his image to have rule over his world, or the creatures of his world. And the Chaldeans were dehumanizing people.
Is that another one?
No, this is still.
The same one?
And he reduced them. The Chaldeans would reduce them to the level of a mess of fish. Right, number 2, the Chaldeans' brutality. That's verse 15. They used the hook in his hand then. The Chaldeans would use the hook in the hand. And this is, some people during that time would literally drive a hook through the lower lip of the captives. So here's what he's picturing then. Here's this hook through their lips, and they're being hauled off to Babylon. Okay, we're still under number 2. He talks about the net. And this is then the net in which the fishes would squirm. Okay. But the Chaldeans used brutality as in their planning. They boasted of their ruthlessness. They gloated over the misery which they inflicted on others. So Habakkuk is asking, how could God permit this? Number 3, the Chaldeans' sensuality. 1:16. He worshiped then. He talks about they sacrifice into their net and burn incense to their drag. This is talking about he was worshiping then his military ability, his instruments of torture. And then the fat and the meat plenteous, that's which belongs to deity. So the prophet pictures the Chaldeans worshiping that which brought them prosperity and temporal pleasure.
They worship that.
Mm-hmm. That which brought them prosperity and temporal pleasure. I think that's where we get, and I should look this up, but the god of Bacchus, which is the god of wine and alcohol, was one of the gods of the Chaldeans. And in Daniel chapter 5, when they're doing their drunken feast, that's who they're worshiping, but they're using those cups that they got from the temple in that drunken feast. And that's one reason why God holds them accountable, because those things have been used, set apart for use by God. They were holy, and they were using them for the drunken feast. And God says, I've had enough. So, all right, number 4 is the Chaldeans' ruthlessness.
We already had ruthlessness.
Relentlessness, excuse me. Relentlessness. Thank you. And he does this in a rhetorical question. Shall they therefore empty their nets and not spare continually to slay nations? They're dumping their prey. And they hurry off to get more prey. All right. This also then goes into chapter 2 and verse 1. So Habakkuk then is challenged the plan of God. And the response is going to be quite different than what Habakkuk expected.
He challenged the response of
Yep.
God.
Mm-hmm. All right, he uses upon my watch and my tower. So here is Habakkuk then setting himself up as a watchman to watch what God would do. He would be alert, like the watchman's supposed to be. This is not an arrogant demand of God. But Habakkuk wants to know what God would say. So he's listening carefully. He's watching carefully. So now God is going to respond.
In verse 2.
Verses 2 through 20. And we're going to break that down a little bit, but that's... All right. And now notice how he begins. And the Lord answered me. God did not have to answer the prophet. He is not bound to debate the mysteries of life. But here is the marvelous grace of God. And his response is probably far different than what Habakkuk expected. Now, the response is not secret or mysterious. He's to write the vision. He is then to preserve it for a wider audience. He says, make it then plain upon the tablets. This would be the tablets like the Ten Commandments, Exodus chapter 20, the Ten Commandments there that are found, Exodus 24:12. All right, now, the Jewish rabbis declared that there are 613 individual statutes of the Pentateuch.
Say that again.
The Jewish rabbis declare that there are 613 individual statutes of the Pentateuch.
What was the figure again? My mind.
613.
Statutes.
Yes, individual statutes of the Pentateuch. And they're reduced to one principle in verses 4 and 5.
Pentateuch.
P-E-N.
T-E.
T-A-T.
T-A-T.
E-U-C-H.
Okay.
Pentateuch, I think, is the
Pentateuch. Okay, 613
individual
individual
statutes of the Pentateuch.
reduced to one
Principle, verses 4 and 5.
Okay.
All right.
The just shall live by faith.
This is also the equivalent of a modern billboard.
This whole 2 through 20.
Yeah. For what he's telling him to write on the tablets and run that read it, that they may run that read it. So put this thing up, okay, so that everybody can read it. Then we're going to see that he says you need to publish it so that those who are running can read it. I think that's what the message means. It is a vision of urgency. And I don't know if where you go to worship has a sign out front, but where I have preached, they have recommended certain size letter for, all depends on how close you are, how far away you are from the highway, and how fast the traffic goes. But
Hello?
uh, okay. Yes, do that. All right. So we got that one. Make it large. Let's see. The character of the vision. And I have 4 things here about the character. Number 1 is to be a declaration. It is for an appointed time.
Second one?
No, that's still the declaration. It was on God's calendar. Whatever the hardships, the discipline, the future looked bright. Number 2, encouragement. It hastens. All right. The appointed time, let's see which the vision pointed to was a definite as the end. Okay. But it shall end, talks about there. And probably reference to the last days, Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. God,
that's under encouragement?
Yes, this is still under encouragement. Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. God, who at sundry times and divers manners spake in time past to the fathers by the prophet, hath in these last days spoken to us by his Son. Messianic hope. Number 3 is exhortation. He says, wait for it. All right. Believers should not get discouraged and give up on the vision. And the Septuagint then suggests that this is a messianic illusion. Okay. Abbreviation for Septuagint is LXX.
Can you say that one more time?
The Septuagint renders this in such a way that it's a messianic illusion. And I said the abbreviation for Septuagint is LXX. That is Roman numeral for the 70. So anytime you see that in commentary or something like that, instead of spelling out Septuagint, they'll put the LXX. Okay, and that's what it's talking about. All right, all the hope of the believer is wrapped up in the person of the Messiah. And this is Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 37. Number 4, assurance. It will come and will not delay. From God's perspective, however, events are right on schedule. Galatians 4:4, in the fullness of time. So, wait on God. That's right. All right. Now, verses 4 and 5, he starts again, and he says, behold. Okay. So here are two groups then in this, in these two verses.
Two groups.
Yeah. They who rely on themselves and those who rely on God. That's the two groups. Okay. Now let's talk about group number 1. Now he's going to call them the proud. Some translations may have puffed up, but he says lifted up in the King James. They're conceited. All right. The Chaldeans, the Babylonians, however you want to refer to them, consequently, they stand in jeopardy in respect to God. Their arrogance, then, to their addiction to wine. And we talked about Daniel chapter 5 and the drunken feast there. And then also in their pride, they would not stay at home. Neither keepeth at home. No matter how many people died, death is never satisfied. Number 2, the righteous. All right. And this stands for the righteous, then, stands for those who are right standing with God. It has a legal flavor. They have been judged innocent by the heavenly judge. Look at verse 4 now, because this is quoted in Romans chapter 1 and verse 17. Maybe some other places, Galatians 3:10.
3:11.
Yeah, okay. All right. So here's talking about the just shall live by faith. Okay. And here's one who steadfastly trusts in God. It's not a life of works. But that would lead to pride, which is condemned in the first part of the verse. Right. But those who become righteous by faith must continue steadfastly in faith. Now, understand when we're talking about this steadfastness in faith, that was the outward then in praise and worship and good work, godly works. So it's not works alone, but it is faith that spurs these and stirs these types of actions on, where it would be an outward praise, an outward worship, and a godly works, but it's also from an inward heart. That's what God always has wanted. Faith expresses itself in faithfulness. So this is both temporal and eternal.
You said faith expresses itself in
Faithfulness. Let's see. I wanted to get to this next point that I wanted to. Let me find out where I was now. Turn on. All right. All right, here it is. In trying times, a righteous person must trust God to handle the situation appropriately. In trying times, a righteous person must trust God to handle the situation appropriately.
saying that for my benefit.
No, I underlined this already before we, but yeah, but okay. Now, this offers hope. The proud would receive their due. They will be cut down. Those who are living by faith must continue to live a life of trust in the trying times. Now, in verses 6 through 20, here's a description of God's judgment. The haughty unbelievers will face the wrath of God. Doomsday for the Chaldeans was coming.
God's judgment, description of God's judgment.
Yes. Let's see. Here's a parable against them, verse 6 then. This is a taunting proverb. They would mock the fallen king and derive joy from his overthrow. And then it uses the word all. Shall not all these, Okay. Here was the nations brutalized by the Babylonians. Even the smallest nation would join in this proverb. Now we have 5 woes then that begin here with 6. In 6 we find a woe. In 9 we find a woe. In 12 we find a woe. In 15 we find a woe. And in verse 19 we find a woe. Okay. So this is a lamentation then. And it often then is followed by a threat. Judgment is always implied. So in essence, the prophet was singing a funeral chant over those who were at odds with their Creator. And if we understood the Hebrew, and if we could read the Hebrew, we would see some literary devices that Habakkuk is using, and it's lost in its translation, but understand that there are some literary devices used in the rest of this chapter. Now, in the first woe, it's pronounced on those whose increases that which is not his own. Woe to him that increaseth that which is not his. Okay. They borrowed from other people. And the prophet asked then, how long is this going to last? This abuse. And the tables would be turned. Verse 7. Suddenly is what he says. And it would rise up and bite them. Those who confiscated their wealth would have their wealth confiscated. All right.
Get it on. 8 o'clock.
Yes, ma'am. And the why he's also, he sheds blood in the process of piling wealth. And number 2, he has done violence to the land. And thirdly, he's done violence to the city and its inhabitants.
What was that third one again?
Done violence to the city and its inhabitants, verses 7 and 8. The second woe then is on the unholy ambition. All right. And he's talking about the Chaldean king here, or the Babylonian king, because he was concerned about his dynasty. And it says that he would set his nest on high, and he would, there was another one here too. But that means he wants the peak. He wants to establish it upon
The highest pinnacle.
yeah, and he wants it up high so nobody else can touch it. Those who by hook and crook attempt to move from the apartment to the penthouse. And then also he wants to have his wealth to shield himself from the negative circumstances. Verse 9.
He wants to do what? Say that again.
He will have his wealth to shield himself from any negative circumstances. And then his actions then are just the opposite of what he intends.
What do you mean by that?
Okay, he didn't want to shame his descendants, but what he's doing is going to shame his descendants.
This is the Babylonian king.
Yes. And he says also that cutting off many people, there is price gorging.
Gouging.
Yeah. Which causes great suffering and even death in extreme cases. So in spite of his efforts to establish a lasting dynasty, his house will crumble. And he uses the collapse of a physical structure to talk about then the fall of the dynasty. The third woe, verses 12 and 14, is pronounced against those who would build a town with blood. Oppressive policies, forced labor, and then all of this that they had built would come crashing down. The city that's used in these verses, that's verses 12 through 14, is talking about the apex of humanistic culture.
That's what they have, right?
Mm-hmm. We're talking about the kingdom of darkness in contrast to the kingdom of God. And I think in this, verses 12 through 14, he's talking about the eventual spreading of the gospel. All right, verses 15 through 17, we're talking about the next woe.
Number 4.
Okay.
And that's what verses? 15 through
17.
17.
This is the shameless action of the king of Babylon.
Shameless.
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 One who lives wicked then is determined to drag others down with him. The king of Babylon delighted in luring others into the debauchery.
Yeah, so what you said about the debauchery? Sorry, I can't keep up.
The king of Babylon delights in luring others into debauchery for which he is famous. All right, this is talking about the drinking of alcoholic beverage. And he would spike the drinks then to look upon their nakedness. The total incapacitate the victim. And this was for humiliation, take advantage of it. Some take the idea of to look upon his nakedness as sexual immorality. But we find the cup of the Lord's wrath would come around. Okay. Let's see. All right. The Chaldeans then would fall to such shame for three reasons. Number one, because of the violence done. And part of this is because of the physical. They stripped the beautiful mountains of their forest and destroyed the wild beast. Second, they were responsible for the blood of men, bloodshed. Thirdly, they had done violence on the land and those who dwelt therein. And their land then will be treated with the same ruthlessness. All right, then verses 18 through 20. And in this, we're going to find the number 5 woe. All right, we've already stated this, but let me restate this. The people then created their own gods and invented their own moral standards. And this is not good. So in this, he's going to remove all hope of the Chaldeans to rely upon their gods for protecting them from judgment. The fifth woe then is structurally different. It begins with a rhetorical question. Okay. About the benefits of an idol. And there are two types of idol mentioned. Here is then the carved idol and the molten image. And these were strictly forbidden in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 4. All right, and then he talks about the impotency of idolatry. Number one, it is then the creation of mere man. Number two, It is a teacher of lies. It is in contrast with the invisibility, omnipresence of God. Thirdly, they gave the idol the appearance that it had supernatural powers.
This is under the impotency of idolatry still.
Yes.
Okay.
But they were a lifeless image. And then next, I think it'd be fourth, the idols were dumb. They could not communicate. The idolaters awakened their idol each morning, bathed them, fed them, and pretended that they were living beings. So they bathed them, fed them, and pretended they were living beings. The image, though, could not teach. It had no breath.
You said they bathed them, they fed them, and
Let me find it now.
it doesn't matter.
Let's see, they bathed them, they fed them, they pretended that they were living beings. The glittering gold could not conceal the lifelessness of the idol. In contrast, here was God in his holy temple. This is the heavenly temple, far above the earth. He does not need the doting of the devotees concerning about his health. The only response to his awesome rule is silence. Those that oppose him, those who would instruct him, and those who would question him must submit to his majesty. Let all the earth keep silence.
Can you restate that, please? Those that would oppose him and that right there.
Those that opposed him, those that would instruct him, and those who would question him should submit to his majesty. So those who would oppose him, those who would instruct him, and those who would question him should submit to his majesty. Chapter 3. This is a prayer, then Habakkuk.
Prayer of Habakkuk.
Mm-hmm. Habakkuk acknowledged the ultimate victory of God. And then it will conclude then with the prophet's reaction to the mighty display of divine power. You say, how do we know that it's a prayer? Well, it begins, a prayer of Habakkuk. And I think when you look at the context of this chapter 2, the ending of the Lord is in his holy temple, let all the earth keep silence before him, then this is the natural flow. Okay. Solomon urged God to respond to the prayers of his people when those prayers were directed towards his temple. I think that's what Daniel did when he went up and he prayed then towards Jerusalem. Habakkuk then addresses a prayer to that temple in full confidence that the Lord would hear that prayer. Now notice he is then the prophet. He mentions this prophet, his office again. The cliche that the priest represented the people before God, while the prophets represented God to the people, is only half the truth.
I'll say that again about the priest.
The priest, it's a cliche that the priest represented the people before God, while the prophets presented or represented God to the people. This intercessory prayer was essentially the responsibility of a prophet. So here is then a model for God's people in the face of what appears to be injustice. The prayer reflects the submission of the believer to the ultimate justice of God. The prayer reflects the submission of the believer to the ultimate justice of God. Now, if you'll notice in verse 1, it talks about Shig-I-On-Noth. And this is then designated to be sung in the temple by the Levitical singers. And it appears to be a song that was sung with great emotion. And so this prayer then outlines God's plan for the future of his people until the end of time.
Could you repeat that, please?
The Habakkuk's prayer outlined God's plan for the future of his people until the end of time. God's plan for the future of his people until the end of time. So here is faith expressed then, and it grows in strength. All right. Verse 2, it says, then it's addressed to God. Now, during this time, they did not hesitate to use the covenant name of God. It's the intertestamental period when the Jews got to the point where they were avoiding the pronouncement of God's name. And they would substitute the name Lord for the name of Yahweh. So here is then the reference to all of God's work which God has done in the past. And I think we'll stop right there for this evening. Then we'll start there. That's will be, what's next week? 6-6?
I think so.
Yep, we'll start there next week because I have some petitions there. And then we'll get into Zephaniah. So have another little test for y'all. Okay, thank y'all.